Ladyship, you'll be relieved to hear, I suspect, that I don't propose to spend much time, and this is no criticism as my learned friend did, going through the evidence at 3:20 in the afternoon. It's inevitably a selective exercise.
Yes.
I don't criticise my learned friend at all for having selected the parts of the evidence which support his case. And the same can be said, I suppose, of the judge's judgment, because it's inevitably the case, in a case with a very large amount of evidence, huge number of witnesses, in fact, which we managed to get through in 4 days, that the judge is going to have to be selective in the parts of the evidence which he considers to be important. So I'm only going to deal with one matter, if I may, which is of real importance, and it's the emphasis that Madame Friend has put on the School of Excellence.
Yes.
Now, right it is that when this case was originally pleaded, there were references to the School of Excellence, and it's right to say that at that point, that part of the case featured more prominently than it did by the time of trial. Indeed, it is pleaded that a number of other boys from the School of Excellence went on the trip to New Zealand, and as you have been shown by the learned friend, that is almost not the case. There may have been one other. By the time this case reached exchange of witness statements and the opportunity properly to explore the evidence, the focus was very much on Nova Juniors, not the School of Excellence. And that's why, in fact, there was very little discussion, both in submissions, or indeed, as I recall, it's a while ago, in the evidence, as to how many of these boys came from the School of Excellence. The focus, in this case, the basis for the judge's findings on vicarious liability revolved around Nova Juniors. And my Lord, Lord Justice Stuart-Smith asked the question about Nova Juniors, and I just want to spend a moment, if I may, taking you through the history of that. Nova Juniors was really, I suppose, two separate creatures. For years, it had been a team. In fact, I think at one stage there were 2 age group teams called Nova Juniors, and Mr. Roper had someone else helping in South Manchester. The purpose of his running a team there was to provide Blackpool Football Club with a steady source of talent from which Blackpool could obtain its players for the future, and also, as we've seen happens from 2 of those players, make the club a good deal of money when 2 of those players who went on to play for England were sold by the club in March 1986, just before, in fact, the New Zealand trip, literally a month or so, 2 or 3 months before the New Zealand trip. And that club, that team, which had been run by Mr. Roper and was designed, intended to be a source of talent for Blackpool exclusively. True it is that players went elsewhere for their own personal reasons. I'll come back to that. But designed exclusively to be a source of talent for Blackpool, had reached the age, gone beyond that particular age group, and wasn't in existence as a team before the trip to New Zealand. And the key passage, maybe in this case, in relation to this, is perhaps paragraph 134, I think it is, in the judge's judgment. Page 106, the core bundle. And here the judge is dealing with the setting up of the new Nova Juniors. And this was a different creature because it wasn't going to be based in South Manchester. it was to be based from boys who were going to go to New Zealand and who were then going to play for Nova Juniors from the Fylde area. And Mr. Roper was to run it. And you'll see what the judge says about that, beginning at the second sentence, if I may. When the boys got back from the trip, Roper set up another team called Nova Juniors. Connecting this with the earlier evidence I've summarised, the probability is that the earlier Nova Juniors team had outgrown youth football, and so this was a moment for Roper to reset the team by starting again with a new team of young boys. He uses the word I infer, I'll come back to that. I infer that he used the New Zealand trip partly as a means of drawing boys in to join the fresh Nova Juniors, which was itself a means of bringing them to Blackpool Football Club until they reached the age when they could be formally signed up and tied in. And the respondent, Claimant, said, I understood Nova was based in the Blackpool area for people who had been on the tour. That was key because this was Mr. Roper adopting his old role, but this time not in South Manchester, but in the local area. And the recruiting was the New Zealand tour. And although his lordship used the word I infer, there was specific evidence about that. Can I, first of all, take you to Mr. Ellis, the manager's evidence. First of all, in the supplemental bundle in his witness statement, at page 110. He's dealing here, first of all, with the Nova Juniors in South Manchester, in the softball team. He says, when I joined Blackpool as manager in June 1982...
Hold on, please.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Page 110, bottom of the page. When I joined Blackpool Football Club as manager in June 82, the youth team manager was Jack Chapman. Paul Stuart was already signed to the club, as was David Bardsley. Those, of course, were the two who went on to make the club a lot of money. Paul and David went on to play in the Premier League and for England. They'd been brought to the club as schoolboys in the 70s by Frank Roper, who I was informed was a scout for the club, who'd been running a feeder team for the club for a number of years prior to my arrival as manager, who Paul and David had played for together. Roper had a reputation within the club, including with the board of directors, for bringing good quality youth team players into the club from the feeder team he ran in the Manchester area. And there was plentiful evidence from a number of witnesses to the same effect. Of course, this particular respondent, this particular player, didn't play for that team. It had run its time. The boys had grown up, or they'd gone on to play for Blackpool, and then been sold on in the case of Stuart and Bardsley. But it was run for several years. And he reinforced that recollection, Mr. Ellis, in his oral evidence. If I can ask you to turn to the transcript bundle, to page 160. Yes, this is the sort of division of labour, so to speak, and why there was a team in South Manchester which was providing talent to Blackpool. What Mr. Ellis says is, at letter F, Bill Hurst used to do some scouting for him. This is for Jack Chapman, right? I mean, we were short of finance, as you mentioned, and we couldn't afford to scour the country. Frank Roper did the Manchester area, and Jack and whoever he had doing it with him scoured the local area.
I'm sorry, I'm very sorry. Could you repeat the page number?
I do apologise, I'm going too fast. Page 160 of the transcript bundle from letter F. And I was picking it up at letter F.
Thank you.
First of all, he describes what Mr. Hurst did. He would do the... sorry, a G. Frank Roper did the Manchester area, and Jack and whoever he had doing it with him. So that's Chapman and Hurst or whoever else it was. Scoured the local area. Question, other than that, presumably we're not going to turn away offers if some local junior club manager put forward a player. And obviously, if they obtained players from other sources who were good, they would use them. I'll come back to how successful that team was and the benefit that Blackpool got out of that team in a moment. But just before I do, can I take it forward to the second Nova Juniors and the evidence which I say supports that, which actually would have entitled the judge to use a word I find rather than I infer, because it's express evidence about it. And it comes from the evidence of Mr. Sharp. And the judge deals with that. Best place to look at that evidence, perhaps, is in his judgment, beginning at paragraph 149 on page 109. He's talking first on paragraph 104. Mr. Sharp, perhaps I can pick it up at the beginning of the section for Frank Sharp at paragraph 147 through this page. He's dealing there with the approach that he had from Roper, together with Chapman and Hurst on the touchline, and his request that 4 of his players come join this team, or rather come to the New Zealand, go on the New Zealand tour, and how he felt that they were there, the other 2 were there to give Mr. Roper credibility. And then at 148, he says after that trip, his lordship said, Sharp saw Roper start up his new Nova Juniors team in the Fylde area. This team was based around the boys who'd been on the New Zealand tour. Sharp's own son had been on the New Zealand trip, wanted to continue playing with the New Zealand boys, and left Polton Youth to join the new Nova Juniors side and do that. And then he recalls a passage which the judge cited. Nova Juniors would play some of the games at the Blackpool Football Club training ground. He was poaching the best players, which caused some consternation locally at other sides. He took Nova Juniors to watch the Blackpool first team playing very often. Sharp sometimes went with them. Roper had his own section of the stadium where he would sit. And then he recounts an occasion when another coach from another team sat in that section, and Roper was not happy about that. Then, if I can skip on to paragraph 151, finally, Mr. Sharp explained in cross-examination how Roper used Nova Juniors to capture boys who were too young to sign forms. Once they were in Nova Juniors, Roper had them cocooned. Can I come back to that curious word? And they played friendly, controlled matches, not in a league on public view. No one else could scout them because no scouts were allowed to come and watch. He was a strong personality. He kind of used the boys, the camaraderie, to keep them together. So if anybody got approached, and there was always boys getting approached since they started in the school system, he would use the network of the boys to ridicule it and say, you're not going to get any good there, to corral the boys together and keep them together. He was charismatic. And then he goes on to deal with the control that Mr. Sharp perceived he had over Mr. Chapman. And that word cocoon, what is meant by that? And what the evidence that the judge had from numerous sources was that he created an environment around these boys so that which generated an allegiance to Blackpool football, be it playing in a feeder team or going to Saturday to watch matches, going to meet the players, going to the Tangerine Club, being taken out for dinner, all of those things. And he did that initially. We have the evidence from many of the witnesses, like Mr. Bradshaw, who was involved in the old Nova Juniors. And he did it again here. And the purpose of that was to keep the boys together until the moment when they could sign schoolboy forms at the age of 14. I think there was evidence that this wasn't something that Blackpool did and nobody else did. This was a means by which clubs could recruit talent and make sure that they didn't leave, didn't become susceptible to other scouts seeing them and persuading them to go and play for other clubs. And of course it's the case, as a learned friend says, that some of them did go elsewhere. Perhaps some of them thought that they were better than Blackpool. And it may very well be that Mr. Bradshaw went off to play youth football from Manchester United. In fact, at the age of 16, the evidence was he came back to Blackpool. There it is.
Can I just ask, Mr.
Yes.
Counsel, please? So this is the evidence of Frank Sharp that we see in paragraphs 147 to 151.
Yes.
But so we've got the idea, as you say, that Roper was cocooning these boys so that other scouts couldn't poach them.
Yes.
But where do we get from that to he was cocooning them for Blackpool rather than for his own means of offering them to other clubs?
Well, because let me take you to a couple of other references, if I may, back to Mr. Ellis, if I may, in the supplemental bundle. I think it's page 111. Yes, it's paragraph 7.
Page?
Page 111.
Thank you.
What Mr. Ellis says about that, and of course he was manager at the time, is Nova was a feeder team solely for Blackpool.
Yes, but I'm talking about Mr. Ellis. You've taken us to the assessment of Mr. Ellis by the judge.
Yes.
And obviously, as you say, there is evidence
Mr.
that...
Sharp.
Forgive me, yes.
Yeah.
Mr. Sharp, there's evidence there that the judge refers to in describing this cocooning, which I now understand. But where do we see what we see in Mr. Ellis's statement, that this was for the benefit of Blackpool Football Club rather than because Roper was very possessive of his signings and wanted them to go to Manchester United or Tottenham Hotspur or Coventry or wherever it was?
Well, one of the pieces of evidence is the evidence that we have from Mr. Ellis about that it was exclusively for Blackpool.
Yes, but Mr. Ellis may not have, sorry, Mr. Sharp may not have agreed with that. I'm just wondering if there was anything from Mr. Sharp that ties that part of his evidence up.
Yes, this may answer your ladyship's question, I hope. At page 38 of the supplementary bundle,
Thank you.
Is his statement. And having dealt in the paragraphs 11 and 12 and so forth with the trip to New Zealand, he then, at paragraph 13, deals with whether or not there were any payments made to Roper. And then towards the end of that paragraph, Mr. Sharp says, I was, however, worried that Roper would use the trip as an opportunity to put pressure on my son, Kevin, to join Blackpool. I remember thinking that if this happened, I would not allow Kevin to feel pressurised into signing with Blackpool if he did not want to.
Well, that's the trip. We've been talking about Nova Juniors.
Yeah, yes, the trip was the catalyst for the setting up of the new Nova Juniors.
Yes, I understand that.
Yes.
But you've taken us to this part of the judgment where the judge is referring to the very point you're making, that it's the Nova Juniors that's the feeder team for Blackpool and set up specifically with this in mind. Now, on that basis, I think, having seen the word infer,
yes,
I'd like to know if Mr. Ellis ever said that that new Nova Juniors team, which was after the trip in any event, was carrying on as before and only introducing players to Blackpool Football Club. I mean, this was after the event, wasn't it? After the trip. So when did the first Nova Juniors come to a...
Must have been a few years before, because the likes of... I can find out, I'm sure that somewhere it has the dates, but it must have been a few years before, because some of the players were quite a bit older.
So unless this was in prospect, Mr. Kent's arguments this morning would be, well, the Nova Juniors is a red herring as well, because the trip took place before Nova Juniors that was set up in the filed area and gave rise to all of this comment from the judge. That was after the event. So are you saying that the trip to New Zealand was specifically set up to recruit for Nova Juniors?
Yes.
Which would be set up. So where did we get that evidence?
Well, I'll have to, if I may, come back to you and find...
Yes, of course, because we'll go over to the next day.
You've got paragraph 13 on page 38, and then you've dealing with Nova Juniors as set up on their return. You've got 15 to 22, paragraphs 15 to 22, which don't quite say it, but they indicate a predisposition towards Blackpool.
Yes. Certainly, I'll have to check whether there are any other specific references to that, but certainly that was the evidence of the link between Blackpool and Nova Juniors given by some of the witnesses who had been with the previous Nova Juniors.
Yes, so
quite a lot of it.
The previous Nova Juniors were based in South Manchester.
Yeah.
The new Nova Juniors were based in Filed.
Yeah.
Filed?
Filed, yeah.
Filed.
Yeah, the filed area.
Yes. So there's the different geography, and it appears that the Nova Juniors had come to an end before the New Zealand trip.
Yes, sometime before.
And so, if this was a recruitment drive for Roper to repopulate a new Nova Juniors team, somebody presumably must have given evidence about that, because otherwise this trip to New Zealand being before the Nova Juniors team would have rendered that consideration OTOs, wouldn't it?
Well, as I say, I'll have to check what evidence there is.
Yes, I think so.
I understand that. But that's certainly the inference the judge drew. And even if there is no other evidence, and I will check, it's a proper and reasonable inference from the fact that there was a history to Nova Juniors, albeit in a different place, called Nova Juniors, run for several years at least, quite a few years I think, by Mr. Roper, which was intended to be a feeder team for Blackpool. And there are plenty of witnesses who use precisely that expression.
But presumably there should be some evidence, if the judge was going to make that inference, that Roper had this in contemplation and had involved Blackpool Football Club in, as it were, acknowledging that fact. You're going to have to establish, aren't you, the link between the trip
I follow.
and that's what I'm interested in.
What there was before.
Yes, please. But we can do that overnight, perhaps.
So that would
Counsel.
That would be very helpful. Can I just go back though?
Yes, of course.
With one reference to the earlier Nova Juniors, if I can call it that. We've heard about the witness CFS, and if you turn out, of course, he was in the old Nova Juniors, if I can call it that.
Yes.
And in his witness statement, he says at page 72, I think it is, in the supplemental bundle. Paragraph 14, page 72. CFS, and this is but one example, there are others. When I was around 13 or 14, I signed schoolboy forms with Blackpool, but it couldn't actually have been before he was 14. It was Roper who introduced me to Blackpool. Once I'd signed to join Nova Junior, I was basically considered to be part of Blackpool and to have signed schoolboy forms. I cannot specifically remember signing schoolboy forms with Blackpool, but certainly I remember that once I'd signed with Nova Juniors, I cut ties with other professional clubs. He produces as an exhibit to his witness statement a couple of photographs which show a number of boys. I'm sorry, it's page 81 and 82 at the end of his witness statement. Two photographs which show a number of boys, including himself, signing schoolboy forms. And he explained that in his evidence. I'll take you to it in a moment. This took place in a hotel in Manchester, I think. And in that first photograph on page 81, you can see Mr. Chapman. And in the second photograph at page 82, you can just see on the left-hand side Mr. Roper. And this was a number of the boys, all of whom who played for Nova Juniors, signing schoolboy forms which connects them to the club, commits them to the club, prevents other scouts from approaching them at the age of 14. And if I can just take you to his evidence about that, it's in the transcript bundle at page 142. Yes, I think this is a re-examination. He's asked about the boys who were playing for Nova Juniors. And at letter G, or rather between F and G, how many boys, I asked, played for Nova Juniors in the season? He says, for the 5 years I was there, the core side was probably around about 9 or 10 players. 9 or 10. And then comes back to that. I ask him again at letter B. There was a group of 9 or 10. Yeah, 7 players signed. So out of those 9 or 10 Nova Juniors core players in a particular year, about 7 signed for Blackpool as schoolboy players. So this wasn't simply Mr. Roper occasionally putting a player Blackpool's way, nor was it, as Mr. Hurst says in his witness statement, occasionally putting a player, sending a player to Blackpool. If I may just take you to Mr. Hurst's evidence about that in the transcript. He's asked about his use of the word occasionally at page 215 in cross-examination. And picking it up in the middle of the page 215 of the transcript. He says, I ask him, just above D, I just want to ask you, Mr. Hurst, if I may, about your use of the adverb occasionally. That's a reference to his witness statement. Can you now remember how often a player from Nova Juniors would go on to join Blackpool as an associate schoolboy? I can only remember Paul Stewart and David Bardsley, and obviously he'd remember those two. Right, do you know of a young player who played for the Blackpool team called CFS? He's the one, the witness I've just been referring you to. Do you remember him? Yes. He played, I think, for Nova Juniors. Do you remember that? He played for Nova Juniors. Then there's a problem with background noise on the video link. I then ask at the bottom of the page, and if I gave you some more names, might that help you to remember them? Let me give you some more names, Mr. Hurst, if I can. And then we go through a list of names, all of whom were the boys in that photograph, and one or two others who played with CFS in that year. Picking it up at D, I ask, CFS told us when we heard from the listeners that they all joined Blackpool, joined as associate schoolboys in the same year. Do you remember that or not? I couldn't swear whether they all joined in the same year, but I do remember them. And if that's right, I ask, according to CFS, 7 boys from Nova Juniors in the year in which he became an associate schoolboy, including himself, who signed up to Blackpool associate schoolboys. Would you accept that? And then I list them again, and he finishes by accepting that it was really rather more than occasionally. It's possible that they were all signed in the same year, but I cannot remember whether it was the same year. So this was genuinely, as the judge found, the way in which Blackpool recruited its best young talent. And Nova Juniors were the most successful of that, including, of course, the 2 players, Stuart and Bardsley, who a number of witnesses, including the appellant's witnesses, accepted, literally saved the club from financial extinction because they were sold, I think both of them for 350,000, which in those days, of course, was a large sum of money for a football club and saved it from going out of business. We heard that from Mr. Johnson, I think.
I think one of them only made 150, actually.
I'm sorry?
I think one of them only made 150,000.
Yeah, together they were 350,000. Yeah. I think it was 200 and 150. And to come back, and that's important in this case because of the importance of the clubs, looking at the club's business activities. This club, of course, depended upon the recruitment of talented young footballers. And this, if ever there was a role which was important for the survival of a club like this, not just because they could occasionally sell one for a substantial sum of money, but just to keep the club going and keeping it successful, it was this. And the process of recruiting that talent, as I say, was a crucial part of the club's business activities. And Mr. Chadwick agreed that the proceeds of that sale had saved the club from financial disaster. Mr. Ellis, in a passage which my learned friend read out, when pressed on whether the club was wholly dependent on Roper, he said, no, of course they weren't wholly dependent on Roper, but they were largely dependent, were his words. That's the transcript at page 161 in cross-examination. Take you to it. It's already been read out by Mr. Kent. And as I've said already, of course players were free to come and go, and did. And of course 1 or 2 of the players didn't sign up and sign for other clubs. But essentially, this was a critical part of the club's business activities. And Mr. Roper played a hugely important role in that. And it was an arrangement which benefited both. It benefited Mr. Roper because, of course, it made the team that he was coaching more attractive to play for, because it was a feeder team for a professional football club. And sad to say, it also, of course, provided him with a steady stream of young boys. And it made him an important person at the club. There's a passage in the evidence that the judge heard from Mr. Ellis about the aura he had. Can I ask you to turn in the transcript bundle to page 168? This is a passage from Mr. Ellis's evidence. Apologies, it's 169 between letter A and B. In 168, he's dealing with the meeting at the Tangerine Club. At 169, I ask, perhaps just above B, one of the answers you gave my learned friend just now was that Frank enjoyed the aura, his aura, at Blackpool. Do you remember saying that? Or did you mean by that. I meant that he was held in high esteem at the club. Everybody knew him. He didn't come very often. I didn't see him very often. But whenever he was there, he was never knocked back on anything. He would walk in if he wanted. He'd go to the players' lounge, quite a privilege. And what about those who ran the club? What was their stance on Frank Roper? I think I always got the feeling they were pleased he was associated with the club. Why? Well, because of the players he brought. He had a good reputation, and it seemed he only wanted to bring the best players to Blackpool. So they had first choice of a good group of players who, like the other two who were sold, might have, not only on the pitch, but financially as well, they might do the club well. And then he goes on, I think, I ask you, you told Mr. Kent that your view was the youth system was dependent to a large extent on Roper's involvement, without a doubt. Can you explain what you meant by that? Yes, because his team contained some of the best players from the Manchester Stockport area, who would have been looked at by the big clubs in Manchester. Frank preferred to bring them to, I think he probably preferred to be a big fish in a small pool. And part of that cocooning, to use, I think it was Mr. Sharp's expression, was the social side, social events at the club to which these boys were invited. Mr. Roper arranged for them social nights out for the young players at the social club, the Tangerine Club, attended by the appellant's coaches and players. What that meant was that it reinforced the links between the club and the young 11, 12, 13-year-old impressionable boys who were being given the chance to meet footballing heroes for the first time. And then we come to the foreign trips, because that was part of it. And my own friend is quite right to say that there were a number of other trips. And some of them, curiously, not many boys went on. I think there was evidence of one where a boy went with only two others. But those were arranged for young recruits and potential recruits, including, of course, this trip to New Zealand. And it was a trip which was endorsed by Mr. Ellis, who was the manager of the football club. He said, of course I went there.
What exactly do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? The evidence was that at a critical moment, with a meeting of worried parents who knew that their children were being invited to go off with a sole adult,
yes,
he said, well, my son's going, I'm happy with it. Or, well, I think that's almost exactly his words.
Yes, and
How is that an endorsement by Blackpool?
Well,
and what do you mean by an endorsement? Sorry, that's at least three questions.
Well, I think the evidence was, and this is what the judge found, was that the boys would not have been allowed to go had it not had that Blackpool imprimatur. And part of that was Mr. Ellis standing up at that meeting and speaking to the other parents.
But on what basis, I'm sorry to interrupt you,
no.
But on what basis could we say that was, or could anybody say that was Blackpool endorsing, rather than Mr. Ellis, who happened to be manager of Blackpool, endorsing? It doesn't turn it into a Blackpool trip. He's not authorised by the board to do anything by way of endorsement. But I'm just troubled by the vagueness of the word endorsement.
Yes. I think Mr. Ellis's evidence was that because of his position, even though he went there as a parent, the other parents would have made a decision to allow their boys to go because of his support for it. And, of course, the club contributed to it. And we heard that evidence from Mr. Chadwick. The club contributed, albeit a small amount, but £500 towards that trip. And the judge found, although Mr. Chadwick couldn't recall whether it was this New Zealand trip or the previous one, Johnson, thank you, Mr. Johnson, not Mr. Chadwick, please. The judge found that it was this trip, and the reason that he gave for that was because that New Zealand trip, as opposed to the other one, which I think had been 2 years before, occurred immediately after the sale of the two players, the netting of £350,000 or whatever it was. And Mr. Ellis deals with that in his witness statement. And I maybe in the transcript, page reference, so give me a moment.
When you are re-examining Mr. Ellis about this meeting, and we see this from page 167 onwards, you ask whether he was attending as a father because your son was interested in going, yes. Did you speak formally? Did you stand up and address the rest of the room? Yes, I did. I'm not expecting you to remember the details, but what did you say to them? That it was a good opportunity for the boys, that they seemed to get on well, the group that they had, and I was quite happy for my lad to go and have the experience. Well, you don't get many chances or much chance in your life to go, do you, to places like that and to play football and be competitive. I thought it would be a good education as much as good for football. I meant that because I was saying my lad was going, that some other people would probably be confident to let their kids go as well. But why should your saying it make them more confident? Well, because of my position at the football club. So far as, and then you go on to the Tangerine Club. But basically, he doesn't say that his view was that it was a good opportunity to get boys into the Blackpool Football Club grasp. But that there was an opportunity for all of the boys to play football, be competitive in New Zealand.
Yes, which is why he allowed his son to go, because I don't think he had any ambitions for his son to play for Blackpool. I think it comes back to the link between Nova Juniors and the tour, which I'm going to need to think about overnight.
If you would, please. I think that's quite a significant link.
Yes. Yes, I think Mr. Sharp deals with the meeting at Tangerine Club as well. And of course, as I think I've already referred to, Mr. Sharp was concerned that his son would be pressurised into joining Blackpool whilst he was out in New Zealand.
That's in his witness statement.
Yeah. It's in... sorry. Thank you very much. Paragraph 13, page 38. Yes, that was the passage that I read out, which comes at the end of page 38. Yes, paragraph 38. After dealing with whether or not there were payments to Roper, he makes the same point. The trip was pitched as the opportunity of a lifetime, and as a parent I felt obliged to agree to Kevin going. I was, however, worried that Roper would use the trip as an opportunity to put pressure on my son Kevin to join Blackpool. I remember, and then he went on to think about what...
But this is the point that Mr. Kent made this morning, that the other parents and he settled on the purpose of the trip being, rather than receiving anything from Ellis's talk or anything like that. And of course, at this stage, we now know that the Nova Juniors was no longer in existence.
That's right. Although, again, we come back to the same point.
All right,
To explore.
Yeah.
And I was going to take you to some evidence about the money that was provided, and actually it's in the transcript of the evidence of Mr. Johnson, and it's at page 234.
I'm ever so sorry, I couldn't stop reading the news items that have been associated with Mr. Sharp's witness statement, and he's included at 44, Frank Roper right on a trip to the USA with a group of Nova boys. And then we see a reference to a young Thai boy. Can you tell me how that's introduced into this witness statement? Oh, hang on, here it is. Yes, I've got it. Sorry, I needn't. So it's 21 odds, and it's another trip. It's not the same trip.
No.
No.
It's another trip. The reference, whilst I'm thinking of it, the reference to the earlier New Zealand trip is actually in the Auckland Herald newspaper clip, while I think of it, in the supplemental bundle, right at the end, or near the end, at 150, where Mr. Roper says to the journalist, I've taken a squad in the middle of the middle column, on page 150, I've taken a squad to the United States 7 or 8 times, broke that tradition by coming out to Wellington 2 years ago. That's the reference to the earlier trip. And in my submission, the judge was right to conclude that it was much more likely that the payment of £500 was in relation to this second New Zealand trip, because they had just sold Bardsley and Stuart. And just coming back, if I may, to the evidence about that payment, I think Mr. Kent was asked who suggested it. I think the answer is in Mr. Johnson's evidence at 234 in the transcript bundle. This is in cross-examination. I ask at letter D, why, do you remember which trip that was between C and D? No, or why it was that the club was prepared to support the trip in that way. And then he says, Sam Ellis, the manager, reported all football matters to the board. It was on that one occasion he brought to the board the proposition, probably the wrong word, brought that the board should consider making a contribution to Frank Roper's trip, which I thought was to the Far East, until I solicited that that was actually New Zealand. And the board discussed it and agreed to make a one-off donation of £500. Why? Because Mr. Roper had obviously brought Paul Stewart and David Bardsley. No doubt it was hoped that the club would gain from Mr. Roper taking some of these boys to the Far East and New Zealand. And I asked the same question again in a slightly more long-winded way. I hope by financially supporting the trip, the club would benefit long-term from some of those boys coming through the ranks and being successful players like Stewart and Bardsley. Answer, yes. So the evidence was that the club were prepared to help in funding this trip, albeit in a small amount, because of the benefit that the club had had from the sale of Bardsley and Stewart, players who have been introduced by Mr. Roper.
I can see how you'd say that's endorsement. You could use the word endorsement in that context. But either later now or tomorrow, can you explain how the concept of control works in this case?
Yes, I will. Perhaps I can do that tomorrow. I have that on my list of things to do tomorrow morning.
I'll keep quiet then.
And the next feature of his relationship between Roper and the club was that he had unfettered access to the club. And we've heard a little bit of that already, the aura evidence that I read to you from Mr. Ellis. He was given full access to the club and to the ground. He was able to invite young players to matches. There was that corner of the ground in which he and the young players sat or stood to watch the matches, and he was able to introduce the boys to what to them would be famous players. He had, I think, a couple of the witnesses described it as the run of the place, and at one point, Mr. Bradshaw told his lordship that he even had his own room at the club in the early 80s. That's at paragraph 14 of his witness statement, just for your reference.
Does that assist at all? This was a very wealthy man. So why wouldn't the club, in the same way as if a very well-known pop star wanted to visit, give them the run of the club too?
Yes,
To bask in their glory, as it were. I mean, this is a man who was quite a wealthy businessman, wasn't he?
Well, we don't know. He certainly gave that impression.
Right, yeah.
I don't think there was any evidence as to...
Well, he paid for the New Zealand trip,
He
which
paid
was...
for the New Zealand trip, but then of
quite
course it looks as though he had his own reasons for...
But whether he did or not, it was a very expensive trip.
Yes, yes. His own room at the club there,
Well, I know that certain people have got their own boxes and such like.
yes, it's a measure of the esteem, to use Mr. Ellis's word, which the club had for him in his role for the club. It was much more than just a wealthy businessman agreeing to sponsor the club, as of course happens. He was much more involved than that. He had a crucial role in the way in which this club operated, and in its future success, and in its financial survival.
You pick your own time now, Mr. Counsel, as to when an opportune moment of...
I think that would be a good time.
Would
I was
it?
going to go on to deal with something else.
Yes.
Thank you
all
very
right.
much, my lord.
Tomorrow, if it's still as hot, please don't bother to come in robes. Just...
Thank you.
We'll see you as and when. We won't. We'll see you at 10:30, please.
All rise.